Your love and sweet comments truly motivate me. It's because of you that I can bring more and more stories to life. New Year's Eve has always felt a little overrated to me. Too many expectations, too much hype, and always that lingering pressure to make it memorable. This year, I decided to skip the crowded bars and overpriced parties and spend it in a cabin I rented just outside Mariposa, California. Quiet, peaceful, and far away from the chaos. That was my plan. The drive up was uneventful, the winding mountain roads dusted with snow but manageable. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the trees. It was perfect. Just me, a crackling fireplace, and a bottle of whiskey to toast the new year. Or so I thought. The first few hours were blissful. I cooked a simple dinner, played some music, and even started jotting down resolutions for the year ahead. By 10 p.m., I was feeling relaxed and content. That's when I heard it. A faint knock at the door. I froze, listening intently. The cabin was isolated, the nearest neighbor a good mile down the road. Who could possibly be out here? The knock came again, louder this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. Grabbing a flashlight, I approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. My hand hovered over the doorknob as I debated whether to open it. Finally, I turned the lock and cracked the door open just enough to shine the flashlight outside. There was no one there. Feeling a little foolish, I shut the door and double-checked the lock. It's just the wind, I told myself, or maybe a tree branch. Still, the unease lingered. An hour later, as the clock neared midnight, I heard it again. Not a knock this time, but a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the porch. My stomach tightened as I grabbed the flashlight and a kitchen knife. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. I approached the window, careful to keep out of sight, and peered through the curtains. The beam of my flashlight revealed something on the porch. A small bundle wrapped in burlap, tied with twine. It hadn't been there earlier. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The cold air bit at my skin as I crouched down to inspect the bundle. It was heavy, and the burlap was damp. Slowly, I untied the twine and peeled back the fabric. Inside was a large rock, covered in red paint that dripped onto the porch. Or at least, I hoped it was paint. My heart pounded as I stood, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The forest was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I hurried back inside, bolting the door behind me. My hands trembled as I dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. Midnight came and went, the sound of distant fireworks echoing faintly through the mountains. I sat by the fire, clutching the knife, every creak of the cabin making me jump. Then, just as I started to relax, I heard it again. The scraping. This time it was coming from the side of the cabin. I forced myself to investigate, moving slowly toward the nearest window. My breath fogged the glass as I peeked out, but the flashlight's beam revealed nothing. Then, as I turned away, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, just barely visible in the moonlight. They wore a long coat, and their face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, watching. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. They knew I was here. They wanted me to know they were there. I spent the rest of the night locked in the bathroom, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I finally ventured out. The figure was gone, but the porch was covered in muddy footprints leading back into the woods. I didn't stick around to investigate. I packed my things and left the cabin without looking back. As I drove away, my phone buzzed to life, signal restored. The first thing I did was call the property manager to report what had happened. They sounded surprised, but promised to look into it. To this day, I don't know who that figure was or what they wanted. All I know is that I'll never spend another New Year's Eve alone. New Year's Eve was supposed to be exciting. At least, That's what my friends told me when they convinced me to take the drive to a cabin party up in the mountains. It'll be fun, they said. You need to loosen up. So, against my better judgment, I packed a bag, hopped in my old Subaru, and started the 3-hour drive. The first hour went by in a blur of upbeat music and a rising sense of anticipation. But as I climbed higher into the mountains, the roads narrowed, the cell service disappeared, and the snow started falling harder. By the second hour, I was gripping the wheel tightly, my knuckles white as the road became a winding, icy maze. About 30 minutes from the cabin, I noticed something strange. My headlights caught a man standing at the edge of the road. He was bundled in a heavy coat, his hood pulled low. He wasn't waving for help, just standing perfectly still, facing my car. I slowed down instinctively but didn't stop. Something about the way he stood, motionless in the snow, sent a chill up my spine. I kept driving, glancing in the rearview mirror until the man disappeared into the darkness. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just waiting for someone. Maybe I was overthinking. But then, 15 minutes later, I saw another man, or maybe the same one, standing in the exact same way, only this time, closer to the middle of the road. I swerved slightly to avoid him, my heart racing. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of his face. It was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his eyes were wide, unblinking. It wasn't just the cold making my skin prickle. By the time I reached the cabin, I was a bundle of nerves. My friends greeted me with cheers and drinks, oblivious to my shaken state. I tried to relax, telling myself it was nothing, but the image of that man lingered in the back of my mind. As the night went on, the party grew louder. People were laughing, shouting, popping champagne, and counting down the hours until midnight. I started to feel a little better, the warmth of the cabin and the buzz of the crowd helping to dull my unease. But then, just as the clock struck 11, the power went out. The music stopped abruptly, and the room fell into darkness. Someone laughed nervously, blaming the snowstorm outside, while others scrambled for their phones and flashlights. I stepped to the window, peering out into the night. The snow was falling heavily now, blanketing the trees and the road. And there, at the edge of the clearing, stood a man. I froze. It was the same one. I was sure of it. He hadn't moved an inch, just stood there watching the cabin. My breath fogged the glass as I whispered to my friend beside me. "Do you see that?" "See what?" he asked, shining his flashlight toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, but the man was gone. My friend gave me a puzzled look, shaking his head. "You're just imagining things. Have another drink." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't. As the minutes ticked by, the sense of dread in my chest grew stronger. Midnight was approaching, and the cabin felt colder, darker, and smaller with each passing second. At 11:45, someone screamed. The sound cut through the chatter, silencing the room. We all turned to see one of the girls pointing toward the back door, her face pale. The door, which had been locked, was wide open, snow blowing in across the threshold. "Who opened that?" someone shouted. Nobody answered. A couple of the guys grabbed flashlights and stepped outside, shouting into the night, but the snow and wind swallowed their voices, and they came back shaking their heads. "Probably just the wind," one of them said, trying to sound confident. But I knew better. My gut told me the man had been here, that he'd been waiting for the right moment to get closer. The rest of the group tried to shrug it off, but the party mood had soured. Midnight came and went with a weak cheer, the celebration half-hearted. By 12:30, people started leaving. I wanted to stay the night, but the idea of being alone in the cabin with just a few stragglers felt worse than braving the drive back. I packed up and said my goodbyes, promising to text when I got home. The snow had let up slightly, but the roads were still slick. I drove carefully, the memory of the man gnawing at the edges of my mind. About halfway down the mountain, I saw something in the middle of the road. My heart sank as I realized what it was. The same man, standing exactly as before, his head tilted slightly to the side. This time, I didn't slow down. I swerved around him, my tires skidding on the icy pavement. As I passed, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. He didn't turn to watch me go. Instead, he raised one hand, as if waving goodbye. I didn't stop driving until I reached the lights of the nearest town. Even now, I can't explain what I saw that night, but I haven't been back to the mountains since. Some roads, some places, are better left behind. The snow was relentless, hammering against the windshield as I drove down the empty highway. New Year's Eve wasn't supposed to be like this. A broken-down car and a freezing walk to a roadside diner that seemed stuck in time. It all began when my engine sputtered its last breath just past mile marker 42, leaving me stranded miles from the nearest town. I managed to coast to the shoulder of the road and called roadside assistance. The operator told me it would take at least 2 hours for a tow truck to reach me. I was annoyed, but not panicked, until I realized I didn't have enough gas to keep the heat running. The temperature was dropping fast, and sitting in the car was no longer an option. That's when I saw it. A faint glow in the distance. A sign for a diner, just a short walk down the road. Grabbing my coat and scarf, I decided to make my way there. I told myself it was the smart choice. Better to wait in a warm diner with coffee than in a freezing car. The place looked like something out of the 1950s, with neon lights flickering weakly and a 24 hours sign hanging crookedly above the door. When I pushed it open, the little bell jingled, and I was greeted by the smell of stale coffee and fryer grease. The diner was empty except for the waitress behind the counter. She was in her 50s, maybe older, with tired eyes and a name tag that read, Margie. She barely glanced at me as I slid into one of the booths near the window. "Coffee?" she asked, already pouring a cup. "Yeah, thanks," I said. "Do you have a phone I could use? My car broke down a few miles back." She set the coffee down in front of me. "Payphone's by the bathroom," she said, jerking her thumb toward the back of the diner. I thanked her and made my way to the phone. It was an old rotary model, the kind you only see in movies now. But as I reached for it, I noticed the cord was severed, completely useless. "It's dead," Margie said from behind the counter. "Hasn't worked in years." "Great," I muttered, heading back to my seat. I decided to wait it out, sipping my coffee and trying not to think about how alone I felt. The radio played softly in the background, an old rock station crackling with static. Margie disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone in the dining area. A few minutes later, the bell over the door jingled again. A man walked in, dressed in a heavy coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't say anything, just nodded at me and took a seat in the booth across the aisle. I tried to smile at him, but he didn't return it. Instead, he kept his head down, fidgeting with something in his pocket. Margie came back out, her expression stiff as she approached him. "Coffee?" she asked. He nodded but didn't look up. Something about him made my skin crawl. His movements were jerky, almost unnatural, and he kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting someone. I tried to mind my own business, but the tension in the room was palpable. Then, without warning, the man stood up and walked toward the door. But instead of leaving, he locked it, twisting the deadbolt with a loud click. "Hey, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He turned to me slowly, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Just making sure no one else gets in," he said, his tone flat. Margie froze behind the counter, her hand hovering near the coffee pot. "Sir, you need to unlock that door," she said firmly. The man ignored her and reached into his pocket. My heart raced as he pulled out a knife, the blade catching the dim light of the diner. "Everyone stays put," he said. "This won't take long." "Look, I don't have much cash on me," I said quickly, holding up my hands. "Take whatever you want, just let us go." He shook his head, his grip on the knife tightening. "Not about money." Margie moved slowly, reaching for something under the counter. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Just let us go, and we won't say anything." For a moment, the man seemed to hesitate. Then there was a loud bang as Margie pulled a shotgun from under the counter and cocked it. "Put the knife down," she commanded. The man's eyes darted between her and the gun. Slowly, he lowered the knife and dropped it on the floor. Margie kept the shotgun trained on him as she reached for the phone behind the counter. "Sheriff's on his way," she said, her voice firm. "Sit down and don't move." The man obeyed, sinking into one of the booths. I stayed frozen in place, my pulse pounding in my ears. It felt like hours before the wail of sirens broke the silence. When the deputies arrived, they cuffed the man and took him away without much resistance. Margie finally lowered the shotgun, her hands trembling. "You okay?" she asked, her eyes meeting mine. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. "Thank you," I said. "You probably just saved my life." She gave a small, shaky smile. "Guess this place isn't as boring as I thought." I stayed at the diner until the tow truck arrived, grateful for the warmth of the coffee and the steady presence of Margie. I don't think I'll ever forget that night, or the way one quiet New Year's Eve almost turned deadly. We didn't talk much about Harper. She wasn't someone you'd immediately call a friend, more like a shadow that occasionally joined our group. If someone suggested inviting her, there'd always be an awkward pause, a silent exchange of glances before someone begrudgingly said, "Sure, why not?" That's how she ended up coming to our New Year's Eve trip. This year, instead of a party, we'd booked a rental in a small coastal town. It was meant to be a break from the usual chaos. The house was old but spacious, perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, the kind of place that smelled faintly of salt water and wood polish. We arrived mid-afternoon on December 31st, bags in hand, and spent the first few hours settling in. Harper showed up late, as expected. She carried a single duffel bag, wore her usual oversized coat, and greeted us with her thin, unreadable smile. The house had 6 bedrooms, but Harper insisted on taking the smallest one, the one tucked away at the far end of the second floor. "I don't need much space," she said, brushing off our questions. She'd always been like that, aloof, self-contained, and difficult to pin down. By nightfall, the house was alive with music, laughter, and the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs. We ate, drank, and played card games, all the while trying not to notice how Harper sat apart from the group. She participated just enough to avoid attention, but remained a distant figure, sipping her drink slowly and watching us with a detached interest. Around 11 p.m., the power went out. The music cut off mid-song, and the laughter turned into groans as we fumbled for our phones. It wasn't entirely unexpected. The rental owner had warned us about the area's spotty electricity during storms. We lit a few candles and decided to finish the night with stories. "How about we go around and share something strange that's happened to us?" Ellis suggested, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "You know, something creepy." We took turns, sharing half-remembered tales of odd encounters and eerie coincidences. When it was Harper's turn, the room fell silent. She leaned forward slightly, her face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. "There's not much to tell," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Except for that time I stayed at a house where someone went missing." The room tensed, the air thick with anticipation. "What do you mean?" Rowan asked, breaking the silence. Harper shrugged, her expression unreadable. "It was years ago. I was staying with a group of acquaintances, much like this. One of them left during the night and never came back. No one saw or heard anything. It was as if they'd vanished." "And you were there when it happened?" Ellis asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Harper nodded. "We searched everywhere. The police got involved, but they never found a trace, not a single clue." "That's pretty messed up," Ellis said, forcing a laugh. "What happened to the rest of you?" Harper tilted her head, her eyes catching the light in a way that made my stomach tighten. "We moved on. What else can you do?" Her words lingered long after the conversation shifted. Midnight came and went with cheers and clinking glasses, but the celebratory mood felt forced. I caught myself glancing at Harper more often than I'd like, trying to decipher her quiet, enigmatic demeanor. Around 1 a.m., the group began to drift off to bed. I was one of the last to turn in, making sure the candles were out and the doors were locked. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed Harper's door was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked inside. Her room was sparse, the bed neatly made, her duffel bag zipped and sitting in the corner. But what caught my attention was the window. It was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the cold breeze. I stepped closer, my breath visible in the freezing air. "Harper?" I called softly, but there was no response. The room was empty. A sudden creak behind me made my heart jump. I turned to find her standing in the doorway, her face shadowed in the dim light. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice calm, almost amused. "Your window. It's open," I stammered. "I like the cold," she said, stepping past me to close it. "Helps me think." Her explanation didn't sit right, but I didn't press. I mumbled a quick goodnight and hurried to my room, locking the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, the groan of the old house, the distant crash of waves, set my nerves on edge. I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hall. At first I thought it might be Ellis or Rowan, maybe headed to the kitchen for water, but the steps were too slow, too deliberate. They stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, listening. The doorknob rattled lightly, as if someone was testing it. My heart pounded as I quietly slid out of bed and grabbed my phone. There was no signal, of course. The footsteps started again, fading down the hall toward Harper's room. In the morning, the power was back, and the group gathered in the kitchen for coffee and breakfast. Harper was the last to join us, looking as composed as ever. She ate quietly, listening to the others recount their restless nights and strange dreams. When someone asked if she'd slept well, she just smiled and said, "Better than most." It wasn't until we started packing up to leave that anyone noticed her duffel bag was gone. "Did she leave already?" Ellis asked, frowning. "Her car's still here," Rowan pointed out, glancing out the window. We searched the house, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. The only thing we found was the window in her room, wide open again, snow dusting the sill. We left soon after, the mood somber and uneasy. Later, we learned that the rental owner had a record of strange complaints, guests hearing footsteps at night, seeing someone walking along the cliffs only for them to vanish. We never heard from Harper again, but sometimes I wonder, was she the guest who disappeared, or was she something else entirely? I had never been a fan of New Year's Eve parties, but this year I made an exception. My best friend Callie convinced me to join her for a small gathering at a secluded cabin in the woods just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. "Come on, Aaron," she'd said. "It's not some rager. Just a few people, some drinks, and a great view of the midnight fireworks over the mountains." It sounded harmless enough, and after the year I'd had, stressful work deadlines and an endless string of lonely weekends, I figured a change of scenery might do me good. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, a guy named Milo. He was tall, with a quick smile and a disarming southern drawl. "Make yourself at home," he said, gesturing to the cozy living room as we arrived. About 6 other people were already there, most of them lounging by the fireplace or setting up drinks on the kitchen counter. Everyone seemed friendly enough, but I couldn't shake the slight unease I felt. Maybe it was just being around strangers, or maybe it was the cabin itself, too quiet, too isolated. As the night went on, the wine flowed and laughter filled the room. I started to relax, even joining in on a game of charades. At some point, I stepped outside onto the porch for some fresh air. The cold mountain air bit at my skin, and I could see my breath forming little clouds in front of me. That's when I noticed it. Farther down the dirt road, just past the edge of the porch light's reach, a figure stood. They were barely visible, just a silhouette against the darkness. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the figure didn't move. They were just standing there. "Hey Aaron, you okay?" Milo's voice startled me, and I turned to see him leaning against the doorframe. "There's someone out there," I said, nodding toward the road. He squinted into the dark, then laughed softly. "Probably a deer. They're all over this area. Come back inside. You'll freeze out here." I hesitated, glancing back at the spot where the figure had been. It was gone. Embarrassed, I followed Milo inside, convincing myself he was right. It had to be a deer, or maybe one of the guests who'd wandered off for some air. By the time the clock neared midnight, everyone had gathered in the living room. The lights were dimmed, the TV was tuned to a live broadcast of the Times Square ball drop, and someone had handed out cheap plastic champagne flutes. Callie sat beside me, nudging my shoulder playfully. "See? Aren't you glad you came?" I smiled and nodded, but I couldn't shake the lingering tension in my chest. It wasn't just the figure I'd seen outside earlier. It was the way Milo kept glancing at the clock, his smile a little too forced. Or the way one of the guests, a quiet man named Theo, kept pacing near the windows, peering out into the dark like he was expecting something, or someone. 10, someone shouted as the countdown began. Everyone joined in, laughing and cheering as the numbers ticked down. 9, 8, 7. The lights flickered. 6, 5. The room fell silent. The power went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. For a moment, the only sounds were muffled breaths and the faint rustle of someone shifting on the couch. "Probably just the generator," Milo said, his voice calm but too loud in the stillness. "I'll check it out." He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed for the back door. I wanted to call after him, to suggest we all stick together, but the words caught in my throat. I told myself not to be dramatic. It was just a power outage. Minutes passed, and Milo didn't return. Callie squeezed my arm. "Should we check on him?" Before I could answer, the faint beam of his flashlight appeared through the living room window. But something about the movement wasn't right. The light swung erratically, as if Milo was running or being dragged. "Stay here," Theo said, grabbing a fire poker as he headed for the door. But when he opened it, we realized Milo's flashlight wasn't moving toward the cabin. It was heading deeper into the woods. "What the hell?" Theo muttered, stepping out onto the porch. "Close the door," Callie hissed, but it was too late. The figure I'd seen earlier was back, standing at the edge of the trees, their face obscured by a hood. This time they weren't alone. 2 others stood with them, unmoving. Theo froze, the fire poker dangling loosely at his side. "Who are you?" he called out. No response. The figures began walking toward us. Theo slammed the door and bolted it shut. "We need to leave," he said, his voice shaking. The cabin's cozy warmth had vanished, replaced by a suffocating sense of dread. "What about Milo?" someone whispered. "We can't help him," Theo said firmly. "Whatever's out there." He didn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what he meant. Grabbing keys from the counter, Theo motioned for us to follow him out the back. The group stumbled into the icy night, sticking close together as we made our way toward the cars. I could feel eyes on us, the weight of unseen gazes pressing against my back. When we reached the cars, the terror hit its peak. Every tire had been slashed, every windshield shattered. We were stranded. "That cabin," Theo muttered. "It's defensible. We go back." Back inside, we barricaded the doors and windows, each of us clutching whatever we could find as a weapon. Hours passed in silence. The figures outside didn't try to break in. They just waited. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, the figures were gone. We ventured outside cautiously, searching for any sign of Milo or the intruders, but there was nothing. Just the wreckage of our cars and the lingering fear that they would come back. I never found out who they were or what they wanted. But every year since, as the clock nears midnight on New Year's Eve, I find myself scanning the shadows, waiting for the silent countdown to begin again. It started as a simple tradition. Every New Year's Eve, my brother Liam and I would take a late-night drive through the empty countryside around Hamilton, Ontario. We'd talk about our resolutions, laugh about the year's ridiculous moments, and watch the clock strike midnight from the warmth of the car. This year was no different, at least at first. The roads were unusually dark that night, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Snowbanks lined the streets, untouched by plows since the afternoon's light flurries. Liam had just picked me up from our parents' house, and we were cruising down a narrow, winding road that cut through a forest. The hum of the engine was comforting, even as the trees seemed to press closer on either side. "So, what's your big goal for next year?" Liam asked, glancing over at me with a grin. His blue toque was pulled low over his ears, and the scarf wrapped around his neck made him look younger than his 28 years. "I guess I'll try to get back into painting," I said. "You?" "The usual. Get in shape, save some money. Oh, and definitely stop letting you win at Mario Kart." I laughed, but before I could respond, the headlights illuminated something up ahead. A man was standing in the middle of the road. Liam slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded slightly on the icy pavement. The man didn't move. As we got closer, I could see that he was wearing a long, dark coat and no hat or gloves, despite the biting cold. His face was pale, and he was staring directly at us. "What the hell?" Liam muttered. He tapped the horn lightly, but the man didn't react. "Should we go around him?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Yeah, I guess so." Liam started to steer the car to the left, but as soon as he did, the man stepped in that direction, blocking our path again. It wasn't an aggressive movement, it was deliberate, almost calculated. Liam tried the right, and the man mirrored him. "Okay, this is getting weird," Liam said, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "Maybe he needs help? Or maybe he's just some weirdo," I countered. "Let's not stick around to find out." Liam nodded, throwing the car into reverse. As we backed up, the man didn't move. He just stood there, watching us with an eerie stillness. Once we had enough space, Liam hit the gas and turned the car sharply, taking a different road that veered away from the forest. For a while, neither of us said anything. The radio's soft crackle filled the silence, punctuated by bursts of static. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 11:47 p.m. We still had time to make it to the Overlook, our usual midnight stop, if we didn't run into any more strange detours. "That was weird, right?" I finally said. "Super weird," Liam agreed. "Probably just some drunk guy messing around, or maybe he lives nearby and thought we were trespassing or something." I didn't reply. Something about the man's expression, the blankness of it, stuck with me. It wasn't anger or confusion or even drunkenness. It was something else entirely, something I couldn't put into words. The road we were on now was even narrower than the last. Snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, making it harder to see more than a few feet ahead. Liam slowed the car, leaning forward slightly as if that would help. "I don't remember this road," he said. "Did we take a wrong turn?" "Maybe. There should be a sign soon, right?" We drove on, but no signs appeared. The snow continued to fall, piling up on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. My unease grew with every passing minute. Then, out of nowhere, the headlights caught something again. It was the man. He was standing on the side of the road this time, partially obscured by the falling snow, but unmistakable. His dark coat and pale face were the same as before. This time, though, he wasn't alone. Two other men stood behind him, their features blurred, but their presence undeniable. "Nope. Nope, nope, nope," Liam said, his voice tight with panic. He hit the gas, speeding past them without slowing down. In the rearview mirror, I saw the three men turn to watch us as we drove away. By now, my hands were shaking. I gripped the edge of my seat, my pulse racing. "What is going on? Who are they?" Liam didn't answer. His focus was on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The clock read 11:59 p.m. Just as we thought we were finally in the clear, the engine sputtered. The car slowed, then stopped entirely. "Number no, no, no," Liam muttered, turning the key again and again, but the car wouldn't start. "Do you have your phone?" I asked, fumbling for mine. No signal. Liam shook his head. "Dead battery." The snow muffled everything, wrapping the world in an eerie silence. Then faintly I heard it, a rhythmic crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. It was coming from behind us. Liam turned to look, and his face went pale. "They're coming." is twisted in my eat, and there they were. The three men were walking toward the car, slowly but deliberately. Their movements were synchronized, almost mechanical. I locked the doors, though I knew it wouldn't do much if they wanted to get in. "We have to run," Liam said. "Run where?" "Anywhere but here." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. "We need to call someone. Try the car emergency kit." Liam nodded, fumbling in the glove compartment and pulling out an emergency radio. It crackled to life, the signal faint but usable. He tuned it to the local emergency frequency and called out, explaining our location and the situation as best as he could. "911, can you hear us?" he repeated, his voice shaking. "Yes, we've got your location," a calm voice responded. "Help is on the way. Stay in the car and do not engage with anyone outside." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The men were now standing just feet away from the car, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't knock or speak, they just stood there, staring. Minutes felt like hours. Then, flashing lights appeared in the distance, illuminating the road. The men turned, retreating into the woods without a sound. A police SUV pulled up behind us, and two officers stepped out, their presence a welcome sight. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, opening my door. We stumbled out, trembling but unharmed. We told them everything, but by the time they searched the woods, there was no sign of the men. The officers escorted us back to town, where we finally felt safe. I still don't know who those men were or what they wanted. But one thing is certain. I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps or the way their silhouettes melted into the darkness. And I'll never take a midnight drive on New Year's Eve again.